One of the easiest ways to make your knits look more polished is to make sure that your tension is nice and even. And one of the most common tension problems is something called rowing out. In today's episode of the Apiary, we're going to talk about what rowing out is, why it happens, and how you can avoid it. If we haven't met yet, my name is Lauren Rad. I design knitting patterns, especially accessories, with a particular focus on socks. But I'll do hats and shawls and scarves and fingerless mitts and whatever else strikes my fancy, but not garments because those give me a headache. No matter what you're knitting though, whether it is a teeny tiny baby booty or the largest knit blanket to cover a king-size bed, your stitch tension affects how polished your knit looks. So first let's talk about what rowing out is. And to do that, I have brought a handy dandy visual demonstration. So the swatch on the right in this picture has a really serious case of rowing out. And you can see that the stitches on every other row look different from the stitches on the other rows. The swatch on the left, however, has much more even stitch tension, and you can see that the stitches are the same size in every one of the rows. Rowing out is also visible on the reverse stockinette side. So you can see in this image here, the swatch on the right-hand side has a serious case of rowing out. And you can see that in the gaps between the ridges in the reverse stockinette. The swatch on the left-hand side, however, has much more even tension. And you can see that all of the ridges on that side are kind of nice and snug up against each other. There's not any weird gaps there. So what is rowing out? Rowing out is a tension issue that you are most likely to see when you are knitting flat. And so you do one row of knit stitches and one row of purl stitches. For most knitters, your purl stitch is going to be at least a little bit looser than your knit stitch. When you have rowing out, your purl stitch, which is usually the culprit, is going to be significantly looser than your knit stitch. And so again, with those swatches that we looked at earlier, remember you could see kind of every other row had bigger stitches than the row in between. Those were the purl rows. So the issue here is that when you have significant tension differences between your knit stitches and your purl stitches, you're going to end up with a visible difference that is going to affect the visual element of your knit. But rowing out isn't just an aesthetic problem, it also creates a functional problem. Remember, as a general rule, when you are using the same yarn, a larger stitch, a looser stitch is generally going to be a little bit less durable than a smaller, tighter stitch. So if you have spots in your finished knit where there are larger, looser stitches all clustered together, that creates a weak spot in your fabric, a spot that is more likely to wear through more easily. The other functional issue that it does is it affects the drape of your finished knit. A finished knit garment with relatively even tension throughout all of the stitches is going to have a slightly stiffer, tighter drape. And a finished knit garment with significant rowing out, again, because of all those loose stitches, is going to have a looser, floppier drape. Now, this may not be something that bothers you because maybe you want a little bit more drape in your garment. Maybe you want it to be kind of loose and floaty. If that's the case, I would recommend, instead of relying on rowing out to create that drape, I would recommend choosing a yarn that has drape in it. So some yarn with a silk or linen content, or even alpaca. That'll give you the motion in the knit fabric that you're seeking without creating the durability issues that come from those larger, looser stitches. Now, since for most of us, the culprit of our rowing out problem is our purl stitches, I am going to be focusing on the purl stitches in this episode. However, if you find that you are still experiencing rowing out after trying all of the possible solutions that I'm offering here, your culprit might be your knit stitch. And so you might want to work on tightening up your knit stitches, but we'll save that for later. So how do we fix rowing out? I've got a whole bunch of possible solutions for you. And the first I would suggest is a bad solution. Remember, rowing out happens most often when you are knitting stockinette flat because you are doing one row of knit stitches and one row of purl stitches and one row of knit stitches and one row of purl stitches. Now you might be tempted to say, well, there's an easy solution to that, which is I'll just knit everything in the round. And I suppose that might be sort of a solution, but you're going to be really limiting the scope of what it is that you can knit if you refuse to work large amounts of purl stitches. You're basically not going to be able to knit any shawls or a lot of scarves, blankets. Cardigans are going to be out unless you're willing to use a steek in your work, which I think is much scarier for me than using some purl stitches. There are also some really beautiful garment patterns out there that have the pieces knit flat and then seamed together. And there are some real benefits to doing that, especially when you are looking for structure and durability for your knit garment. So refusing to work flat, it's not a great solution. You're really going to be limiting yourself. The better solution is to try some techniques to fix the tension differential between your knit and your purl stitches. One of the easy solutions is to change your purl style. Now, there are lots of different ways to work the purl stitch. The most common way to work the purl stitch involves inserting your needle purlwise and wrapping the yarn from bottom to top, back to front, and then pulling it through and forming the stitch. But you can also wrap the yarn the other way, and that will create a tighter purl stitch. Now, this has a bit of a drawback, which is that when you get to your knit side, your stitches will be situated differently on the needles from how you're used to having them seated. So normally in Western style knitting, we have the right leg of the stitch in the front and the left leg of the stitch in the back on the needle. If you work this method of knitting your purl stitch, you're going to have the right leg of your stitch on the back of the needle and the left leg sitting in front. So you'll have to knit through the back loop instead of the front loop. Otherwise, you'll get twisted stitches. This is a method called combination knitting, and it's actually how I learned how to knit accidentally. Because as I've mentioned elsewhere, I primarily learned a lot of my knitting skills from videos from helpful, friendly strangers on the internet over the last 20 years. And when I learned how to work the purl stitch in late 2007, early 2008, I wasn't paying careful attention to how that yarn was wrapped, and I wrapped the yarn the opposite direction. So I took it from the back over the top of the needle before pulling it through. This can create twisted stitches on the other side if you don't realize that's what you're doing. And that is what I see happening most frequently with newer knitters who are sharing projects online going, my project looks strange. It's often because they have accidentally twisted their stitches because they were wrapping the yarn the wrong way on their purl stitch. Wrong way. You can do that intentionally and just know that when you're coming back to your knit stitch, you're going to knit your knit stitch a little bit differently. Another method a lot of knitters like to use is what's commonly called the Norwegian purl. I have talked to a lot of knitters who struggle with loose purl stitches and who find that this purling method helps them tighten up their purl stitch a little bit more. I find that for me, the added movement in the Norwegian purl stitch is something that I don't enjoy. And so I have used other methods for fixing any gauge issues that I have when I'm working flat, but that is an option for you as well. Now here's a slightly trickier solution, which is on your purl rows, you can go down a needle size to avoid rowing out. This is not necessarily a good solution for everybody. Why? Because when you change your needle size, you affect not only the height, but also the width of your stitches. And they don't necessarily respond in an equal ratio to that change in needle size. So you might significantly shrink the height of your stitches and not as much shrink the width of your stitches, or vice versa, depending on who you are and how you knit and your personal tension as a knitter. So you may find that if you go down a needle size to correct loose stitches on the purl side of your fabric, it might work great. It might create other problems. So again, this is something you're just going to have to experiment with. Another tip that you can use to keep your purl stitches a little tighter is to think about the positioning of your needle tips when you are purling. A lot of us, when we purl, tend to keep our needles kind of almost parallel to each other. Try to keep them pointing upward, and that'll shrink the amount of space that the yarn has to travel, and that'll make the stitch a little bit smaller. Now here's the trickiest solution, which is also unfortunately the best solution, and it's working on retraining your muscle memory. If you find that your loose purl stitches are contributing to a significant amount of rowing out in your work, one thing you can do is work on loosening up your knit stitches. I know, that horrifies me too. I'm a tight knitter, and I like being a tight knitter because those knit stitches are super, super tighty. But if my knit stitches are super, super tight and there's no way I can get my purl stitches that tight, the solution seems to be I need to figure out how to loosen up my knit stitches a little bit. If, however, you're not a super tight knitter and it's just that your purl stitches are a little bit looser, you can also practice just getting your purl stitches a little bit tighter. Tug that yarn a little harder each time you finish your purl stitch and really work on getting those purl stitches nice and snug. It also might help to work your purl stitches a little closer to the tips of your needles. And that is also going to be something that you can remedy by, instead of working with your needles like this, keeping them pointed up more like this. And then you'll be able to keep your stitches closer to the needle tips. One more solution that I have not tried myself, but that I have seen other knitters swear by, is learning to knit backwards. So normally when we're knitting stockinette flat, we knit one row and purl one row and knit one row and purl one row. And that involves flipping your work over and, moving things around. When you knit backwards, you knit across and then you don't flip your work and you do knit stitches the other direction, going the other way. That can help resolve the tension issues if your knit stitches going in both directions are more or less the same size, or closer to the same size at least than the purl stitches. This can also be appealing if you are one of those knitters who, for whatever reason, just hasn't found a purl method that is comfortable for you. And I'll leave you with one final bonus tip, which is Blocking can hide a multitude of small sins. So always make sure to block your work when you finish, even if it's something like a hat or a pair of socks, because when you soak your knit in lukewarm water, gently squeeze it out and lay it flat to dry, what you've done is you have given the fibers the moisture that they need to kind of open up and settle into place. This will smooth out all sorts of tension issues. It won't fix everything, especially if your rowing out is really severe. But if you are struggling with tension issues, I always recommend working with a natural fiber yarn and then blocking it afterward. This is also one of the reasons that, though it seems kind of counterintuitive, I often don't recommend acrylic yarns to new knitters because you can't really block them out in the same way. You can do things with steam that will kind of slightly melt the fibers, but it's not going to have the same effect, the same smoothing and opening and blooming effect that water will have on wool or linen or cotton. So if you have just slightly minor rowing out, giving it a good soaking and then squeezing it out and laying it flat to dry can make a difference. It can make it look much more smooth and much more polished. And because it has helped those stitches settle into place a little better and kind of even tension out across several stitches, it'll also help reduce the likelihood that those larger stitches are going to create weak spots in your finished knit. Now, I am sure that there are lots of other ways that knitters can address these sorts of tension issues. We could probably go on for several more hours about this topic, but I don't want you to get too bored sitting and listening to me yammer on. If you have other ways that you have addressed these types of knitting tension issues, I would love to hear about them down in the comments below. And if there are enough additional methods, I would love to try them out myself and then make a follow-up video. Otherwise, thanks for being here, and I look forward to chatting next time.